Hello and welcome back to the High Performance Podcast for AFL staff and athletes. My name is Jack McLean. I'm your host, and today I'm lucky enough to have Andrew Murphy as our guest. He's the Sports Science Coordinator and Rehab Strength and Conditioning Coach at the GWS Giants. And then today our chat will be all around strength and conditioning and sprinting, a dose response for AFL athletes. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for jumping on, mate. Looking forward to our chat.
Hey Jack, yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, been a listener and yeah, pretty excited to dig into some stuff and get going.
Absolutely. And for those, no doubt there'll be the AFL industry to be aware of your work, mate. But for those that aren't aware of your background, I guess where did your passion for the industry all start? And yeah, talk about the different experiences. I know you've had a range of different roles in strength, obviously sports science and rehab as well. So yeah, talk us through a bit about your journey as well, mate.
Yeah, it jumped around a little bit in terms of kind of touching all bases in the performance departments, but I started off um, as a youth academy S&C coach, tucked away in the north of Scotland in Aberdeen. First started interning during my kind of undergraduate years, and then I suppose never really left them alone, and then kind of stuck on to be a cover coach, and eventually took on a full-time role um, just after finishing my undergrad, really, um, with the kind of national age grade setup still within that kind of north of Scotland region. So I was responsible for looking over around 80 athletes, obviously not all at the same time across, I think it was four different venues, we called them kind of training centres. So there was a lot of miles racked up on the car, probably not as many coaching hours as you'd expect with 80 athletes, but a lot of driving nonetheless. Um, and then yeah, from there got an opportunity with Edinburgh Rugby. Actually interviewed for an S&C role. And my boss there, Nick Lumley, who I'm sure we'll discuss at some point throughout this, kind of did had already done some digging and noticed some of my previous work for my PhD and kind of some data handling and data analysis I'd kind of put out online. Basically asked me if I'd be interested in becoming a sports scientist. I'd not really too much idea of what that would actually entail, but it was an opportunity, a foot in the door to get into the professional setup. So yeah, took it, got stuck into it, had a good couple of years there. And then yeah, randomly, I don't want to say actually randomly, probably off the cuff is probably more of a better phrase. Applied for a job at the Giants on a rainy Sunday night in Edinburgh, and through a couple of phone calls and a couple of 2 a.m. interviews, and here we are. And this is now third year at the Giants as kind of sports science and rehab S&C. So it's been a bit of a dart around the profession, but we're getting there.
Yeah, fantastic. And you mentioned Nick Lumley. Who else have been some sort of strong influences or mentors, if you like, that have helped shape your philosophy to date?
Yeah, I think I've kind of had a couple at each stage. Like I said, there's been a couple of stages. From starting out, my boss within the academy was a guy named Fraser Murray, who's an S&C coach in Italy, working in rugby union at the minute. He was really good for me starting out. He really enforced the importance of detail and coaching. Um, and really having strong rationale for everything that you put in your program. So even as an intern, he would often set me random tasks and lure me into a false sense of security, invite me out for dinner or beer, and then all of a sudden he'd pull out of his back pocket a program I'd written as part of a task, and he'd say, "All right, we're going to dig into this." And you're sitting on your main course having a beer, and all of a sudden you're trying to justify why you've done X amount of sets, X amount of reps for this athlete under this circumstance. Um, no, it wasn't always the case, but his attention to detail in terms of programming and execution were extremely high. And he also kind of put me on to kind of different S&C coaches at the time, like Eric Cressy. He was a big fan of in terms of shoulder health, and I played ice hockey and got a couple of banged up shoulders, so there was definitely some mutual interest there. And then, like I say, Nick Lumley was kind of the first to give me the foot in the door at Edinburgh Rugby. he was he was pretty straightforward in that he thought there was a an opportunity there to become a sports scientist. Although I was interviewing for a strength and conditioning job. He put a lot of faith in me in terms of just random skills in terms of coding and analysis that we discussed in the interview. Um, and they were really trying to build the sports science department at the time. So he put a lot of faith in me to really come in with not a lot of experience in that area and just try and build a department. And there was also like the department there in itself probably got to give a strong amount of recognition to. We had Luke Vella, who was our rehab S&C at Edinburgh, for the first year that I was there anyway, and he was among one of the most professional and knowledgeable kind of rehab S&Cs that I've ever met or ever spoke to. Again, his detail and understanding around his application was probably second to none. And then he obviously moved back to the Rebels, where he became the HBM. And he was succeeded by Aidan Oakley, who was another kind of world-class rehabber who was at the Rabbitohs. So I was fortunate enough there to work with Lummers, who is kind of pretty well renowned in the world of strength and speed development in rugby union. And pretty outspoken on his views and um, what's possible with athletes. So I think at Edinburgh, I know the term microdosing gets thrown around a lot in S&C. In Edinburgh, the word maximal recoverable dose was thrown around a lot. So it was a bit of a different environment in terms of obviously without being reckless, how much can we tip in and adapt while still getting athletes to perform. So I think that was the biggest thing, and that performance was still number one, but it was how much can we push physically to make these athletes better in the long term. And then there's obviously the research side. Um, Obviously, we'll talk about sprinting and whatever else. I took a lot from kind of JB Maroon stuff, and my PhD supervisor and Paul Swinton is again among one of the smartest people I've met in terms of understanding how to interpret data and actually analyze data effectively within the context of kind of strength and conditioning and sports science, which I think doesn't probably get enough attention.
And what you mentioned, like your data analysis background and interest before Edinburgh. What were some of the qualities in the interview stage do you think that Nick saw in you to? It sounds like that was quite a big role to basically launch the sports science program. So
Yeah.
obviously saw some strong traits.
Um, Yeah, I'm not really sure, mate. Like I said, he'd obviously done some background, and I put some stuff out on Twitter, just with coding and my own kind of research at the time was I was still relatively early in my PhD. I still hadn't even put out my first paper yet, but my first paper was I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it's the biggest meta-analysis that's been done in strength and conditioning. Um,
Wow.
so it includes 643 studies, and that was pulled down from 900 odd. Um, so we were handling fairly large data sets early on in the PhD, and I'd put some things out there in reference to that, and he was, I think, in the back of his mind, although the job advert was for an S&C coach, they weren't really sure at Edinburgh at the time whether they were looking for a kind of jack of all trades S&C coach to come in and fill some holes, or they were kind of gonna go in a different direction and grab someone to try and kind of launch a department really. So in the interview was it started off S&C based,
Mhm.
and then we can probably done myself an injustice. I probably didn't do my own research as well as I could on Nick. So me and him actually got into a bit of a debate around sprinting and
Mhm.
kinetics and kinematics associated with acceleration and then max velocity performance. And we kind of had a little back and forth, and obviously he won.
This is in
But
the interview.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think he was potentially just a bit impressed, and they're going back the bit of back and forth, and yeah, he'd obviously like the idea of someone that could have a conversation about these kind of things and dig a little bit deeper. Um, so yeah, yeah, it was a bit strange, mate. He called me maybe 40 minutes after the interview. I was in the car back up to the north of Scotland in the middle of nowhere and said, yeah, we're not going to offer you the job as an S&C coach, but we will offer you the job as a sports scientist if you'll take it. We think you've got all these skills, X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, it was a case of, I think the interview was on Friday. He was like, when can you get to Edinburgh? I said Monday. I had family living in Edinburgh, and then it was a case of, yep, all right, we'll move right down and get stuck in.
Fantastic. That's huge. And going to the flip side, I guess your biggest highlights over your career to date, like moments that are special, that sort of spring front of mind that you're proud of.
Yeah, I think the very first one that springs to mind is when I first started as an intern in the academy, and this is probably where the love for S&C and kind of development kind of became instilled. Uh, as an intern, I was kind of put in charge of the youngest kids that would come into the academy, the 13, 14-year-olds. And I had this one athlete that I was, say, predominantly in charge of, programmed for, or prescribed for, from the age of 14. And we kind of moved through stages of the academy together, where I moved from intern to contractor to full-time member of staff, and he moved from junior academy to national academy, and then he eventually went on to get a professional contract when he was 17, turning 18. It was round about the time where I was kind of just moving from that kind of full-time role into, it was towards the end of my full-time academy role. But that was probably the win of seeing this young guy go from 14 years old to professional rugby player, and be able to witness him training every day and every step of kind of his journey. It was just, it was obviously, it felt like a joint achievement. Obviously, he's the athlete, but yeah, it was not a proud parent moment, but there was definitely something in it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then obviously the Edinburgh one, in terms of coming in with not much insight into sports science, not many applied skills in sports science, and especially in a professional setup, and then being handed a laptop on day one and saying, we use Power BI, we've already got X, Y, Z connected. This is kind of what we're rolling with at the minute. And it was a very rudimentary, here's a GPS dashboard, here's a wellness dashboard, a couple of Z scores, and it was, okay, build out this system for us. And let's look at whatever you want to look at. The sports scientists come with questions. We can debate what's actually relevant, what's not relevant. And then when I think I left Edinburgh, we'd got to the point of, yeah, Power BI was completely automated in terms of it would refresh once or twice a day. Reports would pump themselves out, and we had multiple dashboards for rehab, multiple for the kind of daily setup of the squad, medical dashboards. We had integration with the analyst data. So we to the point where we ended up just doing a lot of kind of different side projects of dimension reduction of physical versus match performance metrics. And yeah, we did some sprint profiling, and yeah, it was more just the freedom to say that we're rolling here.
Mhm.
When coming in with, like I say, not a lot of insight, and coming from definitely a more coach perspective, to, all right, here we're gonna actually we're gonna have to hammer down here and see what we can dig into.
Going back to the academy athlete that you're working with while you're interning, and then throughout both your
Mm.
progressions, like for the, I guess, footballers or athletes listening in, at what point in his career did you sort of notice, oh, I think this guy's going to make it all the way? Was it right at the end, or could you tell from when he was 14? Yeah, well, and if so, what were
You
the traits?
you definitely couldn't tell when he was 14. Um, yeah, he came in really skinny, pretty lanky kid at 14, and then yeah, it was maybe 16, 17. He started to, I think he definitely grew about 6 inches and put on about 10 kilos. But he was among the most diligent kids that we worked with in the academy. Like, wouldn't skip a meal, would listen to every single bit of advice you'd give him. And then just started to really dominate in the national competition. So it was kind of like that kind of 16, 17 year period where we thought, okay, he's grown into his physical assets. And he's really kind of transferring that into his performance now. So we've got a bit of a weapon. And although, like I said, towards the back end of my academy kind of employment, I was kind of all over different venues. He was we we don't actually get a lot that make it through to the next level because of just the Scottish rugby setup, and the Central Belt kind of dominates in terms of player production. So it was just really nice to see one player progress all the way through. And like I say, his diligence was kind of second to none. He left as a 17, 18-year-old, if you want to get into specifics. I think he was benching like 120, 130. I think he squatted 180, 190. He was 6'6". Ran probably 9+ meters a second, and he was a tough back rower. But when you looked at him at 14, I think he came in a little bit timid and a little bit this kind of shy kid, but obviously left a bit of a beast. And
Yeah.
obviously you can't put that all down to S&C. Obviously, puberty and maturation takes a bit of a hold in that. But I would just say if there is any kind of young footballers out there watching, just bide your time. It'll come. Maturation happens. And if height or weight's probably not going to be your thing, then look at some other qualities and speed, power. What else can you achieve from the S&C side? Leave the game to the coaches. That's not me.
Mhm. And on the flip side, there was some gems there in terms of landing your first full-time contract for sports science, strength and conditioning coaches that are working towards that. You mentioned, obviously your research that you were doing at the time. It sounds like you didn't hold back in the level of detail that you were going in with that. Talk us through your mindset with, I guess, when you started that pursuit for that PhD. Did you want it to be something special, something that stood out, or did it sort of evolve that way?
Um, yeah, it definitely evolved that way. I started it kind of off the back of my undergrad. Um, and to be blatantly honest, like I was kind of coming off the back of just being a kind of contractor in the academy, working 2 or 3 nights a week. So I had free time, I had free days. I actually went into because my dissertation, my undergraduate thesis supervisor is still my PhD supervisor. So I actually went in to ask him for a master's reference. And he was just kind of like, "Oh, have you thought about a PhD?" And I was like, "No, no idea." He was like, "You should think about that. You could do it through here. We'll support it, blah blah." And I was like, "Whatever. I'm not going to do a PhD. Who wants to do that?" I was like, "I'll go and do a master's at S&C, and I'll get some S&C job somewhere." Um, and he was like, "Honestly, if you get a first class, you should consider doing a PhD." Brush that off. Came and spoke to him at my graduation. Got a first. He was like, "So when you starting?" I was like, "Mate, I've got no idea. But if you think it'll be better, I'll jump in, I'll do the PhD." And I turned up day one of that PhD, sorry, day one, with the first meeting with him as a PhD student. And I was like, where's my timetable? Like, what,
Yeah.
where's my classes? What am I doing? And he's like, do you understand? And this is all just research. Like, you've got to come with the questions. And I was like, oh, fuck. Like, all right. So I was definitely naive going in. Um, Obviously I had my own interests, but it definitely sort of evolved. Like the first 1 to 2 years of that part-time PhD, I think the topic changed maybe 3 or 4 times, and we eventually landed on this kind of insight into how do we interpret change in strength and conditioning, and how do we further understand the dose-response relationships. And a lot of it was partially off my own back of wanting to actually understand what change is in strength and conditioning. Because if you do read a lot of articles, you'll see that a lot of people are using fairly standard analysis procedures and using the same kind of qualitative terminology to interpret change across a range of different variables. But I knew at fairly young in my career that, well, strength might not change the same as power, and power definitely doesn't change the same as sprinting. Like, so why are we using the same language and trying to interpret these changes as if they're the same when they're not the same in terms of scale and rate and what is actually required to develop them. So my supervisor came up with the idea of, let's just look at everything that's been done. And that kind of developed into this. Yeah, all right, let's get the ball rolling here. Let's look at the differences between everything. What's the differences between strength, power in terms of training? What do we actually need to apply to exhibit small, medium, large change? So that turned into a subsequent 2 years of pulling, well, title screening. If we roll through the kind of steps of running a meta-analysis, it's, yeah, come up with your search terms, run your search terms through your search engines, title screen everything, title abstract screen, and then, yeah, full text screen, and then get rid of it. And I think we actually started with 100. The initial title screen was 100,000 studies to go through, and I did that all myself for about, that took maybe 3 months, and then eventually abstract screen, whatever. But the data extraction itself, when we got down to around 900 studies, took the majority of the 2.5 years between myself and two other people. And then I had to go through it individually to kind of cross check it and make sure everything was as the guidelines that we'd kind of set out. Because obviously everyone's got different interpretations of strength training, what's interpretation of high volume, high intensity, low intensity, etc. So that really kind of grew legs as we went. But that paper's out now. It originally went out as a bit of a two-parter, with a more practical side and a more academic side. But it's essentially breaking down the contextual changes within strength and conditioning per outcome and per training method. And I think, yeah, the final analysis included 643 studies. And it's been cited a couple of times in terms of people actually using new contextual effect sizes that we kind of laid out in that paper, in terms of accurately reporting strength changes versus power changes versus speed changes, whatever. People can go to that paper and use that as a resource to say, okay, this is the expected change we should see from X intervention with X outcome. So this is how we should report said change.
And was that the type of posts or tweets you were posting on Twitter that sort of got any those
Yeah,
actionable?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. Like I said, there was definitely comments out there that I was flying around about just, kind of pilot analyses that you were putting out of, oh, strength doesn't change at the same rate as power, and sprinting can never be changed, and dig into that a little bit more. But like, yeah, sprint performance is the hardest metric to change, etc. And yeah, we got into a bit of a dig around that.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, well, it's a great segue. I guess final question about your career, mate, and then we'll dive
Mm.
into the topic.
Sorry,
But
I seem to have rambling on about this side too much.
I know that's good. It's interesting. Provides good context as well in
Mm.
terms of the background for it all. And there's been some, I think, some really sound tips there as well for S&C coaches, in terms of, I imagine you'd have no regrets choosing the PhD over the masters with how it all eventuated.
I'll let you know in November, mate, if we get
Yeah.
once it's all said and done, then we'll finally know. But 8 years down the line, it seems to be going all right.
Yeah, yeah. What about biggest challenges, which is probably quite fitting? Biggest challenges you've faced, and how did you sort of learn and grow from facing those challenges, both in pro sport but also in research?
Yeah, touch on the sport ones. There's probably a couple there. Probably the outside of the move from S&C to sports science was actually probably the move from being in a being in an academy setup to professional sport. I'm sure there's probably people listening right now that are trying to kind of make that move or want to make that move, or maybe not. But I think for me, the toughest thing was the difference in communication styles that are required. Um, I think in the academy setup, when you're dealing with younger athletes, it's obviously a different communication style, but it's easier to get a bit of buy-in with them because you're wearing the Scottish Rugby t-shirt, like you are employed by the governing body that they want to play for or they want to also be a part of. So when you're talking to a 16-year-old and you're saying, hey, I've seen the guys down at Murrayfield, which is the national stadium, they're doing this. You should probably think about, hey, what's your food look like? Are you trying to put on some muscle? Or are you trying to look and get a bit stronger? Um, and you generally don't need too much more of a personal element. One, because the younger athletes, and obviously there's an age gap there and a generational gap, but also you're standing. Well, this is again my own personal experience. The standing carries a bit of weight with the younger athlete, because they're just trying to impress, right? Whereas you come into a professional setup, and then all of a sudden I was confronted with people that or athletes that have got 100 caps for Scotland and they've been doing this for 20 years, and I was I was barely reading 20 years ago, and they've been training the whole life. Um, but I think Nick Lumley might have done this to me on the first day on purpose, in that it was the first round of kind of gym groups, and he took me, and we used to kind of separate the gym groups at Edinburgh. And each kind of group of 4 or 5 players would have a staff member or an intern with them, kind of with the iPad, going through the whole training program and just making sure everything was efficient, well executed, etc. And he put me with the oldest players. Um, and I was this young, kind of green, naive SNC, well, at that, well, sports scientist there, but like first it was day one, so I was still kind of S&C hat on, and they were doing kind of velocity based squats, and I was there with the iPad pumping everything up, going, "Yeah, boys, you're at 1.2 meters a second. What do we think about chucking an extra 10 kilos on that bar? Let's get to 1 meter a second." And they had no idea who I was, like absolutely none, and they could not have cared any less who I was. And they just looked at me and were like, I think they actually asked them, I was like, oh, who's this kid? It was like, and it was kind of like, all right, well, we can't come in hot. There's definitely a communication element there where we've got to try and maybe just take a step back, build a bit more of a personal relationship. Like the motivational factors are different for a professional athlete than they are an academy athlete. Um, where these guys have been doing it, they're just trying to get to the next week fresh, workouts and niggles. Um, like they're not specifically trying to eke out every single rep at 1 meter a second that I thought was going to be the case, because that's going to get them faster and that's going to make you more robust. But yeah, they didn't know me from the next man in the street at that point. I was just a guy who'd been introduced on day one. So I suppose there was definitely some elements of, yeah, understanding the person and gaining some trust and respect with the person more in the professional environment. Yeah, and then I think I had another one. Oh yeah, the difference between kind of the ability to build a program at Edinburgh and then coming into, like I said, a kind of fairly well-established program at the Giants, where at Edinburgh, I don't want to say there was free reign, but there was always a lot of conversations around, yeah, let's look into this, let's dig deeper into that, because it just wasn't being done. Or it hadn't been done previously, or they hadn't had someone that was dedicated specifically to that. Whereas when I got the job at the Giants, it took me 3 months to actually get over with, it was during COVID. There was a kind of backlog on visas. So I was at home quite often, logging on to meetings at 3 in the morning, hearing these really in-depth discussions and looking at these kind of pre-built dashboards. And Dean Norris was the sports science consultant here, and he extremely intelligent man now at the University of Western Sydney. So it was kind of hard kind of following in and just trying to pick up where his thought process was going. and being able to, yeah, build without kind of distracting too much from the current processes.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing, mate. That's yeah, great insight into some learnings early days and
Mm.
current as well. I guess you mentioned a term that I haven't heard before, but makes a lot of sense. The maximal recovery dose, if I said that right.
Maximal recoverable dose. Yeah. I don't know
Recoverable.
if it's referenced much, but it was definitely thrown around a lot at Edinburgh.
Yeah, yeah, mate. I mean that resonates for sure. Straight away, you think, I guess, your pre-season sort of off or pre-season mode, I guess, in the AFL, you probably lean towards that, and potentially maybe we look at the minimum effective dose maybe in season in some areas. But with all the research that you've done, and obviously with your coach's experience as well, like what are some of your which way do you sort of lean towards? Do you think for building robust, high performing athletes? Is it which
Yeah.
one's sort of your favorite? I guess it depends a lot on the age of the athlete, I guess, and lots of different factors. But yeah, what do you think of both of those sort of approaches?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of layers to that. I think that system worked really well in that environment. And like I say, I think the physical performance department at Edinburgh was of an extremely high standard, but it also required that the players knew what was happening. They knew that they were going to be pushed in the gym and on field, but they knew they would eventually become to tolerate it. And there's only so far you can push because at the end of the day, you still want the athlete to perform. So that's the biggest line in the sand is that as soon as they stop performing, okay, we've gone too far, or they get injured, or whatever the case may be. Um, but I would say, mate, I wouldn't say I lean too far one way or the other, because obviously coming in, they're very different sports and very different contexts in terms of type of athlete. The run demand here in AFL obviously takes priority, and it takes a lot of the athlete's time and effort. Um, so I think there's probably space for minimum effective dosing within AFL, but also don't think that we should forget the physical adaptations and the neuromuscular capacities required within AFL, to just kind of say, oh well, we can't do that because we've got to run 14, 15 Ks. I think the scope to be smart in how you try and how you train and plan your S&C, um, to so that you're not kind of inducing additional fatigue that an athlete's not going to be able to recover from,
Mm-hmm.
but you're still going to try and get the adaptations that you want as an S&C coach. Because I think at the end of the day, no one's trying to hurt an athlete. We're all just trying to make them a little bit better where we can. Um, but context matters, and yeah, athletes matter at the end of the day. So as long as that athlete's performing, it's okay to stretch, but it's when and how it's done, which is probably the biggest point.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess opening up, we'll sort of break down the chat into three key areas like the conditioning, the strength side, and sprint aspects. Starting with the strength, what are some of the key principles that you found in your research and you found to be true also in the applied setting when it comes to strength training for, let's just call it field-based athletes, rugby and AFL, soccer?
Yeah, I think in terms of I suppose research and in the applied setting, I think the basic strength principles of overload and specificity have got to take precedent in almost all S&C programs. And I mean specificity in terms of adaptations to impose demands, and also specificity in terms of similarity of movement. And those things probably kind of take different contexts if you're talking about things like on-field sprint and power, and then kind of more strength-based work. But the basic principles should never be forgotten. In terms of the applied setting, I'm probably more of the opinion that the main thing should always be the main thing when we're trying to develop physical capacities. I think it's easy to get caught up in more complex training methods if we want to use PAP and contrast training and those kind of more, I don't want to say complicated, but yeah, I suppose the more complex methods when the athlete hasn't filled up one bucket yet. So why are we trying to fill up multiple buckets? Um, so until you've really had a go at improving one thing, do you really need to shift the needle into all these different kind of areas? For example, and I think like like I said, it's easy to get caught up, but the athlete should take priority. So should you be stretching an athlete who is young, they've only got a year's worth of experience, do they really need to be doing French contrast training when they can barely squat their body weight? Probably not. Whereas on the other side, you might have a 35-year-old athlete who's been strength training his whole career. Um, all right, where does he sit on the spectrum of what he needs? He might not need, he might sit on that minimum effective dose for strength training, but his training might revolve around more highly specific work in terms of creating variability through movement and trying to really maintain his robustness through variation rather than kind of hammering on the physiological side.
Yeah, well said. I think it's definitely it's something I fall in the trap of, where you do want to get caught up in the next fancy thing and play around and experiment with new methods in strength training. But ultimately, I think that it's a great reminder to have what's the athlete's number one,
Yeah.
adaptation, trying to get out of the program and keeping that forefront. What are some other sort of misunderstandings, do you think, or tendencies we have as an industry to get caught up in that aren't so effective, and what would be some good actionable tips to sort of focus on around that?
I think you kind of use the good word there in methods. Um, you're right. I think we do get caught up in training methods. A term I came across not a while ago, but pretty early on was training systems. So a system can involve a range of methods, but it's how they're applied. Um, and how they can be interpreted differently within different contexts. So I think again, for me earlier on, exactly the same. We can get caught up in everyone needs to squat, everyone needs to do X amount of sets and X amount of reps, and whereas in reality, that's just not the case, or I personally don't feel the case. And this is probably something that I did take from Nick Lumley, and that he was big on chasing adaptation. And I think that's something that's starting to evolve now and that we're starting to realize that, especially team sport athletes who are competing at an extremely high level, some of them just aren't, they're not built to barbell back squat. Like if you got 6'6" key back and he's back squatting, you say, mate, you got to learn how to do it. But you look at it and you watch it and you think, he's all flexed over at the hips. You're just increasing shear and force through the lumbar spine. His patellas are sore because his femurs are 10 feet long and it just doesn't look right. Probably
Yeah.
means he probably shouldn't be doing it. So at what point do we just say that's not the right fit for him? Let's go and leg press. Let's go and do something a little bit more simple, but we're still going to chase the adaptation. So I'm big on prioritizing intent and intensity. So for me, intensity can fall under intensity of load or intensity of effort. So it's how can we manipulate that through the system? Like let's not focus on I really want you to do that. No, it's like, all right, well, scrap that. You're able to leg press heavy or leg press fast, or we're going to stick some bands on it and we're going to make it move quick. We're going to do that. We're going to do that because we're chasing lower body adaptation. We're not, it might be different if someone is earlier, like if you are dealing with a youth athlete who's still learning his body. But in these scenarios where we're dealing with well-established athletes, for the most part, the adaptation becomes more important than the method applied.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. And the with that adaptation, what's some of your favorite ways to, I guess, measure how your program is working for the athlete? So if it is leg press, is it just simply their ability to improve their strength on that leg press, or are you using a different testing measure maybe on the force plates? Talk us through how you sort of, I guess, measure your program for a whole squad, or some of your issues that you've seen in the past that you think are quite effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the fairly low hanging fruits in that you get people to do some heavy twos and threes on their selected exercise, whether it's trap bar, squat, leg press, whatever. And then you obviously track that over time. Obviously, it's pretty hard in AFL with the schedule and, like I said earlier, the run demand, but things like 8 day breaks and bye weeks sometimes offer you that affordability to kind of squeeze those harder training weeks in where we can really see whether we are tracking the right way, tracking the wrong way, where do we need to make change. Um, so that kind of covers the strength side. In terms of jumping, yeah, obviously we jump every week as a kind of acute neuromuscular fatigue measure, but it does also give us that kind of weekly insight into who's trending the wrong way over a long term, as well as these kind of acute fluctuations that you'll see within an athlete. In terms of what we'd actually look at, um, I know it's going to come in full circle in terms in the research of neuromuscular monitoring, but I'm big on it's a jump, it's a jump test, so jump height is important. Although a lot of people look at, peak power and kind of, I don't know, force at zero velocity. And I'm not saying that there's not a space for these kind of metrics, but I think you should really understand what you're looking at and why you're looking at it. And it's the same as strength program. You really got to understand what you're putting in and why you're putting it in. So why wouldn't you do that with your assessment? Why would you just say, oh, well, this paper says we should be looking at time to peak power, so that's what I'm going to look at. Well, it's like, well, does time to peak power relate to X, Y, Z? Then okay, why not look at any of them? What's your most reliable? But that's probably a different kind of caveat side conversation. But yeah, for me, simple metrics, jump height, peak power, they're probably your key performance metrics, along with tracking things like load applied. I think there's definitely scope within the sports science and S&C space to really go into more specific measures of monitoring and performance monitoring, with sprint profiling and how people move. And in terms of the monitoring space, we've got a PhD student, Adriano, at the minute, who's digging deep into that stuff and doing some really good work. So I think the more specific we can get to our assessments, the better.
And you mentioned, the logistic constraints with AFL, with the schedule and the running demands, that it can be quite challenging to, I guess, keep your finger on the pulse and seeing how the athletes, and it's also a long competitive season. What would be like a rough pass mark for the squad? Is it, maintaining their strength leading up to September? Is it, different for different positions? Sort of talk us through, I guess, how do you go about maintaining that strength stimulus across a long competitive season in a high running sport like AFL? And what is the expectations? Is it maintain, is it actually improve for majority of the squad, or do you take a little bit of a loss if they're still performing well?
Yeah, it's a great question, mate, and actually pretty topical because I've just submitted my last paper, or submitted my final study to my supervisor for final comments on this exact topic of kind of longitudinal change within and across seasons, across AFL and rugby union athletes. So it's definitely interesting. I think to touch on the when and how, it's kind of like I said, I think it's taking your chances when you can, especially within this environment. Like I said, rugby was pretty different, where the run demand's not as high. Players, some forwards are only running 4Ks a game, 4 to 5Ks a game, albeit contact demands are very different. But when players are running 14, 15Ks, they're coming in early in the week, we're going to still try and get a strength session into them. It's okay. Well, we've got to go. And intensity wise, like I say, that's probably my biggest driver, and that volume can probably take a hit. But at what points throughout the season can we really, again, not go for 1RMs, not go for twos, but maybe just see where we're at. And that's something that I kind of picked off the back of kind of Dan Zaknich, who I know you've had on. He kind of implemented that really well within our program last year, in terms of kind of finding windows to push. In relation to actually assessment, our final study, I kind of took 2 years of data from the Giants of jumping and on-field sprint data, combined with the kind of the S&C related gym data, and did the same for the rugby union guys. And changes within and across season, without giving too much away for the last paper, because I want to try and get it through a review. And the biggest key indicator of change in these athletes is baseline capacity. And I know that sounds pretty standard, and that, well, people might link that to training status, and that, yeah, younger athletes will get better, older ones will get worse. But regardless of age, if someone has got a really high ceiling, or sorry, they're already performing at a really high capacity, it's actually going to be extremely hard for them to maintain throughout a season or across seasons. So I think maintenance for those guys who are on the top end of the spectrum is pretty important. Whereas those guys that have got a bit of room to move, they might see small incremental changes in power or sprint speed, but for the most part, those changes within season are actually going to be pretty small, and relatively in terms of statistical significance, they might not be meaningful. But my minimum would be maintenance for those with high capacities, and where we can go for those with room to move, we try and go.
Yep, that makes sense. And moving over into, I guess, more of a sprinting aspect, I guess, can you explain the dose response when it comes to your research in regards to sprint training for field-based athletes?
Yeah. I think the dose response terminology, I think it covers all aspects of S&C, right? So every time we apply a stimulus, we're trying to elicit some sort of response. So we've done a kind of couple of papers around that, and we did another fairly substantial meta-analysis with Brad Schoenfeld, me and my supervisor, in terms of kind of modeling the changes in relation to load applied, and other factors such as volume and frequency, and across common strength and conditioning outcomes. And we got some really interesting stuff in terms of the difference in intensities, mainly intensities, required to elicit different responses across outcomes. Now, the first paper established that sprint performance is, again, I think as S&C coaches, we all know it's probably one of the hardest things to influence. It's a really sexy term, right? Everyone wants to be the fastest. Everyone wants to be the guy who trained the fastest athlete. But the reality is it's pretty hard. And I'm not saying that genetics play the only factor in that, fast guys, they're going to be fast regardless, and slow guys, they're never going to get quicker. I don't think that's the case. I think everyone has the capacity to be faster. Like I said, those higher upper guys, they might be close to a limit, but for the most part, people have the capacity to put more force into the ground, and it's about how that translates into the complex action of sprinting, which is probably the most interesting part. So again, we did another subsequent meta-analysis. So there's three, involving only team sport athletes, and then really dig it into the transference of non-specific outcomes as well as, sorry, non-specific training methods as well as specific training methods. So non-specific we categorized as everything you see in the gym, strength training, power training, ballistic training, plyos. And then more specific methods of resisted sprinting, free sprinting, assisted sprinting, which there's probably a bit less research on because there's 30, 40 years of research on non-specific training methods. But again, across the two kind of subsequent papers, really digging into these kind of dose response relationships, intensity was the main thing that came out in relation to actually prescription. Loads of up to 80% plus 1 RM elicited the highest amount of change in sprint performance. Which personally I found quite interesting because a lot of people will go down, oh, you need to run fast to get fast and whatever, and that's absolutely true, but we shouldn't negate the importance of actually getting stronger, especially for these guys who aren't trained in the context of sprinting. They're sometimes not great movers. So kinetically, what can we do to improve their output? Because it's really hard to improve the way someone moves without dedicated, consistent time towards it. And the chaotic environment of the game means that they're going to resort to what works for them anyway. So what can we do physically to increase the output? And yeah, like I said, the things that stand out was training at higher intensities at 80% 1 RM plus, with improvements in the more strength side, resulting in the higher transference to improve sprint performance. Now that's purely in a research setting. There's a lot of caveats around that of a lot of research is done in untrained participants yet. We know that, although the second meta-analysis the third was done in team sport athletes, so you'd expect some sort of training background. But also that a lot of the sprint assessments are conducted over really short distances, right? So that kind of 5 to 10 meter window, we'll know that it's pretty more or less dependent on the amount of relative horizontal force that you can produce. So it's got real applications to the strength side of things. So you can make the argument that the more ballistic training methods and the velocity emphasized training will have more of a carryover to that really quick high velocity contraction that you experience at max velocity. But again, the demands would suggest that we should be looking at getting stronger relative to body weight to actually improve the force that we can put into the ground as a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, like you mentioned, for field-based athletes, pretty important their first 5 meters.
I think
max V.
Yeah, I think we can definitely separate sprint performance into those different aspects as well around acceleration, speed maintenance, speed endurance, whatever you want to call it, and then deceleration. I think for me in an applied setting, especially within rehab, we'll rarely do an acceleration without a deceleration. So I think there's different capacities required for each stage of the run. So like I said, that horizontal force and kind of maybe strength emphasis takes over in that first 5 to 10 meters. Then we're after, you might look at the higher velocity contractions. But the deceleration emphasis it's kind of been a bit of a bandwagon that I've been kicking for a while. In that acceleration is probably more physiologically demanding throughout the context of a game and field sports, and that the change from 3 to 5 to 7 meters a second is probably quite taxing towards energy expenditure. But the deceleration side is, I would say, is more mechanically demanding. So you probably get much higher forces experience when you decelerate, and more kind of, I would say, quote, muscle damage in kind of high-end decelerations. So I feel like it's obviously something that's picking up with Damien Harper's work, that he's been doing for a while now. But it's definitely something that I don't feel should be overlooked. And I feel like deceleration is something that isn't coached well often, but if you can coach it well, it can have, again, especially in the rehab space, some pretty good implications in how much forces players can tolerate effectively and efficiently. And again, it leads into things like change of direction, and how they are able to transition from one position to another position within the context of their own body, and how they're able to kind of change shapes.
Yeah. Yeah. Final question in terms of, like we mentioned a little bit off air, in terms of the physiological understanding, the physiological demands is something that is critical for, I guess, reconditioning athletes. I guess you just sort of broke down sort of key areas there for maybe a long-term athlete that isn't accelerating on the field. They're not decelerating. They're not doing their max V work. What's some of your favorites? And they're not getting the conditioning stimulus of the game. What's some of your favorite strategies in terms of, I guess, trying to still get that stimulus into them in their gym or with cross training, to ensure that when they do start to return to on-field loads, that I guess they haven't detrained as significantly.
Yeah, I think there's obviously the low-hanging fruits in terms of maintaining strength loading, and we can do things like plyos and ballistics, but if someone is really lacking in that space, you can make use of resisted sled work and kind of banded work to kind of really still work on those capacities without going out on the field and doing rep after rep after rep. Like I said, I think it is challenging to change the shapes that a person makes, but there's no harm in trying, right? Especially in that gym setting where you got a lot of one-on-one time. Let's really have a crack at making that athlete more efficient within a really safe space. Um, so, and I think in terms of, sorry, resisted sprinting and kind of horizontally based plyos kind of provide that acceleration stimulus. In terms of decelerating, one thing that I've actually taken a lot from Edinburgh was we did a lot of depth jumps at Edinburgh, and arguably some really aggressive depth jumps, and that players were jumping off of 60 to 80 centimeter boxes and really having a crack. So although I might not go that far in this population, I think when we did some in-house research, there's absolutely no denying the eccentric forces that you have to produce when you do a depth jump off a really high box. So if you can get to a point where you're going off 45, 60 centimeter boxes with a depth jump, that's really going to be close to, if not over, the kind of eccentric and kind of mechanical demands that you're going to experience when you're decelerating. So there's just a couple of options in there in terms of the cross training. Yeah, look, it's probably not my biggest friend. Like we said off air, I'm of kind of the opinion, if we can get someone outside, let's get him outside. And let's get some specific work in. We we had some really kind of set cross training protocols at Edinburgh that have kind of brought over to the Giants in some aspects, and we had some. You were either doing 6:30:30s on the watt bike, 6:45 second efforts, or with 4 minutes off on the watt bike, or you were doing max 1 minutes with 9 minutes rest on the watt bike. So there was only kind of three options, and the idea was either getting that high intensity aerobic top up, or you're getting your real lactate clearance, kind of push with that ability to kind of maximally go for 45 seconds and then kind of keep going. And then the 1 minutes with the 9 minute effort was your lactate tolerance. And can you go for 1 minute? How long can you sit in it? Let your body kind of naturally clear the waste and then go again. So I'm a big believer in that kind of cross train, combined with some longer interval. Like I say, we can't negate the aerobic side of this game, but I think cross training is a supplementary um, to the specific work. So the more specific work you can get in, the better. Um, and like I think you said it there, like we can't negate the importance of the game in this environment. Um, so when it comes to conditioning, I think we can cover all our bases in terms of matching metrics and reaching game volumes and um, peak periods of intensity, um, and everything can match up. But sometimes the game is the game, and we can't physically replicate it. So again, in the rehab space, like I said before, we're not trying to be reckless and get guys in too early. Um, but we had, well, sorry, for a bit of context, we had some examples where with an upper body injury, where we were matching every single metric on the field of what that player would usually do. But we use a heart rate vest quite a bit here at the Giants, and we use the kind of standardized submax heart rate runs where we assess exercise and heart rate, and that kind of last 30 seconds to a minute of the run. And we could see that although this player was matching every single output that he usually would from a number point of view, his exercise and heart rate just continued to increase. So although we thought we were absolutely smashing out the park, the player was continually losing fitness, um, which just further reinforces the importance of specific work. Um,
Mhm.
so I know that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but like I say, cross training to me is, yeah, it's a bit of an adjunct. I know it's definitely required within the context of AFL when guys can't run. Um, so yeah, it's where it can be used, we use it, but where we can get out there, we get out there.
Yeah, yeah. Try and get him back running. Yeah, thanks, mate.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. We've dived into a fair amount of detail there over the last hour. I'm mindful of time. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to touch on regarding the topic of dose response for strength conditioning and sprinting?
Um, oh, I'm unsure, mate. We obviously touched on a little bit about player profiling, but previously, but yeah, there's potentially some stuff there around how we how players differ in terms of how they run and how you are programmed differently. Um, I
Like
think,
bucketing guys.
sorry.
Is that like bucketing, profiling,
Yeah,
different?
yeah, I think there's definitely some scope there in terms of individualizing training. Um, I think I've taken a lot from, again, Jace Weber and Dan Zaknich. We've obviously done a bit of work with the Speed Sig stuff in terms of profiling how athletes run outside of just standard kind of performance-based sprint profiling. So um, Jace is kind of pushing people to kind of look at, which I definitely support, of profiling, are people ground-based runners, aerial-based runners, or kind of somewhere in the middle, and then how does that affect how you would train that athlete? Um, I think it's someone with a base level of understanding can quite easily identify whether someone might be a ground-based or an aerial-based runner. Um, but there's definitely implications on how you program for each. I think the more ground-based runners require a lot more emphasis on kind of hamstring glute strength, and maybe that kind of those kind of horizontal based plyometrics to really, because like I said, it's hard to change how an athlete moves, um, because like I said, they'll always revert to norm. So how do you then? I'm sorry if we have already talked about this. So it's how do you then do what's best for that athlete to make him more robust in the patterns that he's going to move in? So that might be, yeah, additional, making sure his hamstrings are the strongest in the club because he's going to use them consistently to drag himself forward. Whereas that more vertical based runner, he's going to be using his calf soleus. They're going to be going through a load, I was going to say a load of loading there, um, high amounts of load every single time he takes a step. So does calf and soleus strength or kind of more vertical, repetitive, extensive plyos take take more of a focus in their program. So I think there's definitely scope there to kind of further understand how we can apply different strategies to help individuals based on the way they move.
Yeah, rather than trying to change the way they move.
Yeah. I think Stu McMillan's said it quite a lot, in that professional athletes are professional for a reason. They've got some weapons, so let's continue to build on their weapons. So that's not saying negate the weaknesses, because if it's going to be an issue and it's going to be a risk factor for them, then yeah, let's absolutely build on them. But they're their weapons for a reason, so let's just try and make them as robust as possible to help them utilize them.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think it's good. It's not like you're being naive to the fact they've got weaknesses, but you're actually building up those areas so they're less of a weakness, I guess, of breaking down for an injury, understanding strategies. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
And enhancing their weapons for performance point of view. Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And you definitely weren't harping on there, mate. I think you're painting a really clear picture in terms of how you go about things and how the research has helped inform your strategies and the applied side. And I think it's great to have someone like yourself on that dabbles with exploring both options, understanding that the research and the science, but ultimately how you apply it for practical tips for. I know I've got 2 pages of notes, and no doubt that the listeners do as well. So I really appreciate, mate, you jumping on. Last 3 questions for me, mate. Just more about yourself in terms of work life. Do you have any pet peeves from an industry perspective? Anything that sort of fires you up that you wish we could do better or that people need to change?
Oh,
Feel free to.
sorry.
You can rant if it's open floor, mate.
Um, nah, I think, to be honest, mate, um, the importance of being able to have hard conversations is something it's maybe not maybe is a pet peeve that I'm of the opinion that we should all be able to get in a room and really nut it out and have hard conversations without anyone taking anything personally. And I'm sure there might be some colleagues or some staff members that listen to this and if I can probably think I'm the worst for bringing up the hard conversations. But I'm generally of the opinion that we should be able to all get in a room and no one should take anything personally, because at the end of the day we've all got the best of the athlete's interest at heart or the team's interest at heart, and we're all just trying to go about things. We might have different ideas, but I think that's absolutely fine. And that was kind of DC or Dan Zaknich's big thing that I've kind of taken from him was the ability to go in, let's have a hard conversation, but let's all walk out as mates. Um, so that might be one that does get me in a bit of trouble sometimes, but I can't change it.
Yeah, no, it's a strong trait to have. It sounds like that's something that Nick respected way back to the start of your career, mate. In the interview, having a debate and interview paid off, and there was a job offer by the end of it, so it couldn't be all that
Yeah,
bad.
that one could have went the other way, but yeah.
Favorite way to spend a day off?
uh yeah, my missus listens to this, probably should spend the time with her, shouldn't I? But at the minute, mate, it's all PhD. So I'll if we chat again, I'll let you know in November when it's all ticked off, and there might be some golf interspersed in there somewhere. But right now, it's all go. So
Yep, yep. And I guess on that note, mate, obviously we're recording this in the middle of the year of 2024. What's on the horizon, mate? What are you most excited about?
um, yeah, I suppose on a work level, seeing what we can do this year. It's been a kind of up and down few weeks with the Giants at the minute, but all in all, I think we're tracking pretty well. So building off the back of last year, I think it'd be pretty exciting to see where we go. And then yeah, on a personal level, mate, it just comes back to getting this PhD done, getting eight years of work finished and ticked off, and that'll be a nice way to kind of close out the year.
Oh, 100%. What an amazing feeling that will be. 8 years. That's a lot of hard work going into
Yeah.
work. we'll have to add the papers into the show notes, mate. For those that got any follow-up questions, where's the best place to get in contact?
Yeah, I'm not the best on social media, so probably LinkedIn. You probably thought it was a bit of a struggle to get a hold of, but genuinely that's probably the best bet. But I do try and reply when I can. But like I say, I'm not too active, so there won't be too much out there for people to find.
Yeah, very good. Thanks for sharing, mate. And yeah, thanks again for the chat. Thanks for everyone that's tuned in live. If you're tuned in halfway through, make sure to watch it from the very start. Andrew talked a fair bit about his career and the different experiences he's had in the industry as a sports scientist, as well as a strength and conditioning coach. So you'll find that on our YouTube channel until we release it on a podcast in the next few weeks. And then we've got our next live chat, which is just for our Academy members. That will be next Wednesday at 4 o'clock. So I look forward to seeing you guys then.